Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I think we're going to pick up on discussion in a minute. Just wanted to warn our chairs of discussion. I can see Anita there. I know I was in your session towards the end there, so you're quite prepared to give a little bit of a summary of what was discussed there. Is there someone here from the education and young people's group who's willing to, when we get there, give us a bit of a summary of the kind of key findings of that group? Okay, Malini, great, thank you. And I know that, hi, yeah, I can see you now on my screen. Great, we've got representative here, the chair of the geology session, I understand will give us some ideas from the earth sciences and geology part. Great. So thank you, everyone, for productive discussions so far in the session. I know I managed to join 2 of the 3 sessions, so I could hear that it was very, very lively and really interesting. Lots of discussion, I think, particularly on this question of what kind of cross collaborations could, cross-sector collaboration could help us meet the challenge of climate change. I heard a lot that was very solution orientated, which is really exciting, and hopefully will be grounds for further discussion here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the 3 groups in turn, ask you to spend maybe just 5 minutes with your brief answers to those main questions, and then we'll pick up on some of those points and invite people from the groups who weren't able to discuss that to react to some of the recommendations that you've made on the part of your group, or some of the key discussion areas. So I'm going to go in the order of that we've listed or numbered the groups, so that puts you first, I'm afraid, Malini. So I hope that's all right with you. But maybe you can spend just a few minutes telling us some of the ideas and findings that came out of your group, and perhaps indicate where there are areas you're interested in comments from some of the people from those other groups. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Alyssa. And yes, happy to be the guinea pig in reporting back from our group. We had an extremely stimulating hour of discussion on the implications of the 6th assessment report for the school sector. We spoke largely about schools, but we also considered tertiary education and some of the challenges, but very importantly also the opportunities for helping shape a new agenda around climate change and education. So the first thing we need to mention is that, of course, climate change and education are features of the Paris Agreement, and the very preamble of the Paris Agreement reads, affirming the importance of education, training, public awareness, public participation, public access to information, and cooperation at all levels on the matters addressed in this agreement. And of course, within the context of the international organizations following the Paris Agreement, as a result of Paris, there is an international grouping of educators looking at the climate change implications of the agreement for current educational offerings. So that's really important context, because it provides us with an international grouping of educators, professionals, students, etc., to connect this conversation with. So having said that, another very important contextual point is that while most of us were from the UK, we also had one of our participants, Professor Das from the Royal Met's equivalent in India, joining us from Delhi. So there was some international perspective shared. The other important contextual piece is that, of course, while our conversation focused largely on the English education system, the recognition that in the UK, education is a devolved responsibility, and the Scottish education system is quite different, and in some respects, with its curriculum of excellence, further ahead on the sustainability and climate change agenda. So, having said that, to provide some context, we had a number of specialists from the university sector, I hasten to add, and I'll call on all of them to sharpen up the summarization that I'm able to provide. But in short, so we had, and I'll offer them in categories. The key discussion points were to do first and foremost with the capacity within the sector to respond to the climate change challenge. And that had to do with the capacity, the competence of teaching staff to be able to take on this subject and make it meaningful for their own areas of speciality. We also had a discussion about how the current curricular offering could be mainstreamed, and in particular guidance that could be provided to teachers about how they can pick up on different subject areas, whether it's mathematics or geography or economics or citizenship, and integrate climate change. So a discussion about how you mainstream climate change across the current curricular offering. There was a big discussion about and a recognition of the overwhelming abundance that there is already of materials on climate change. So loads of them produced by non-governmental organizations, teachers themselves. In a sense, the market has been absolutely flooded. So how do you know which to use? Where is the quality assurance for some of these materials? And can there ever be a sufficient degree of quality assurance of the materials which are out there? Because there was also a discussion about the fact that, well, teachers are always going to bring in material that they feel is helpful to their teaching and their teaching, their audience of learners. But we also had a big discussion, still within the context of the curriculum, about the role of exam boards. And some of the content pertaining to this subject in exam boards is completely off base and not very helpful. So how can we have a productive, effective conversation with exam boards? Looking up further, we also had the discussion about the policy change agenda with regard to the curriculum, and that was we have a new opportunity now with a new Secretary of State for Education, a new schools minister, really opportune time to help shape an agenda, not just because of the UK COP presidency and Glasgow in a few weeks, but the UK will continue to be part of the Troika, the presidency, for the next 1 year. So how can we help shape a post-COP agenda also on education? Also a question about, well, what's the role of parliaments? What's the role in particular of the Select Committee on Education? How can we engage them in a process leading to potentially an inquiry or a royal commission on the government response to climate education, particularly in the context of the net zero mandate and climate change targets? We had a discussion which was also separately, so the second category is about jobs and skills. So the Green Jobs Agenda, there's a National Green Jobs Task Force, but the question arose using, for example, the debacle of the HGV lorry drivers shortfall, that are we fit for purpose in terms of the alignment, or is there a mismatch between the skills, the young people who are coming out of the education pipeline and the jobs of the future? So how can that alignment be better between the skills that we're training young people for now, whether in the formal or FE or formal education system, and the jobs, the new jobs of the decarbonized clean economy? And how can that be a much more central feature of the climate change education debate? The third key issue that we discussed was fantastic to be talking a lot about the mitigation agenda, but where does adaptation come in? We have adaptation and the focus on resilience and infrastructure have for too long been the poor cousin of the debate around mitigation. So how can that be brought in effectively, mindful of the fact that for schools around the country, the primary risk of climate change is physical. It's physical risk. It's around also issues of heat risk for staff, the well-being of learners, etc., and largely unattended to. So to build that also into the picture. I think I will stop there for now, because I'm conscious I have spoken a lot, and either pause now or invite other colleagues in our session to contribute, fill in the gaps, what I haven't managed to remember.
Thanks so much for that, Malini. Thank you. That was great. So I think three key areas for action, and with all of those caveats about the scope of the kind of education system you were discussing, I think really interesting to hear about all of those important partners in delivering good quality, correct education to different kind of levels, but also this important focus on adaptation to climate change as well, which I think you'll hear when we hear from Glenn came out quite strongly, I think, in some of the activities, or at least around the geologists as well as the mitigation side. So we will, and then the education and skills, of course, hugely important. So good three main points there for everybody else to be holding your comments, please. I think what I'm going to do is go through all three groups and then give people a chance to jump in on any of the key points raised, but those are the three here: collaboration around education, skills and training, and how do we get adaptation better covered. So fantastic, thanks. Now I'm going to pop over to Anita. I know you also have 3 points, so that's good. Following a nice.
Thank you very much, and you won't be surprised to learn that it's going to echo some of the points that Malini has just made. So a summary of our workshop: we had views from an expert panel comprising Resurgence, Save the Children UK, UCL, BSI, World Values Day, and UBS Optimus Foundation. So we're looking at an organizational context, and this is organizations in any sector. We address what the greatest risks, both the current and the future risks arising from the climate crisis are, and the measures organizations should be doing and are doing to raise the environmental and social governance standards. So the key strapline is mindset and reframing. We have 3 recommendations and 2 actions. So recommendations to organizations taking ESG seriously: understand your context and the risks. The environmental impacts by going beyond a conventional hazards-based modeling to systems-based modeling of ecological impacts, but also social impacts. And in respect of that, we think the action is to set up subgroups of experts in this field. We just didn't have the time to explore that here, and we are keen and eager to do that. There are toolkits, and we have the expertise specifically in UCL, specifically in Imperial, to be able to address this. So we think the actions on the Grantham Institute to follow up on this. You have the experts available, willing to develop this. The second recommendation: change and collaborate to take action now. In terms of this, we have a foundation already. BSI described the standards that they have, as well as the ISO standards, where international experts have invested the time to produce standards in governance, in sustainability, and they put social value at the heart of thinking. So the toolkit is there. We had a conversation around communication, and yes, we all work in our fields. We get used to the terminology, and we sometimes forget that when we're in the real world, we need to be communicating with a set of stakeholders. And these are stakeholders that are being impacted by the crisis, as well as the stakeholders who have a responsibility to act on the social and environmental threats that we face. So messaging is very important in terms of the impact, in terms of the values that these standards have and how we can apply them and communicate them. So the action there, we believe, again, for the Grantham Institute, and this actually, I think, relates back to the point the first group made. It can be combined in terms of understanding who stakeholders are, engaging with them, but also a key element of that is child-centric focus, having groups that actually participate, children participating in this. I know Save the Children do that in terms of bringing their views and as part of education, but also their activism and what they see to be important. And that really leads us to the third recommendation, that a central piece of this is children and advocating for the rights of the child. And making sure people more broadly understand that the greatest impact is on children if you're looking at both the current and the future risks. And in terms of the response, making children part of the solution, we are saying they are the future champions of change.
Okay, great. Thanks, Anita. So I think I hear some clear opportunities there to do a better job of sharing our expertise, ours collectively, particularly on impacts, and making sure that we're combining appropriately environmental and social risk as well. So trying to bring that together well. So maybe going beyond in a way what IPCC is telling us, and then doing something integrated that can be used by people setting standards, doing ESG and those kind of things. So that's a great challenge. Then something around making sure that we're making these things communicable and communicated well to different kinds of audiences, and finally making sure that we're listening to and empowering and engaging with young people, as well as some of the usual suspects. So quite a lot of really interesting ideas there, and some direct connections, I think, to what we heard before, as you said, from the education and learning group. Okay, great. Well, so before we open up the floor, because I'm sure lots of people who have quite a few things to say or to respond to that, if we can go over to Glenn with a third group of Earth scientists.
Hi, hopefully you can hear me. I'm just sat at Simon's desk. Perfect. Okay. We can frame things actually within the three working groups, the IPCC, in a quite natural way, because it tells our story quite well, we think. So working group one, which is just published this AR6 report, is really looking at the climate science. What is the state of the climate today? In fact, we didn't spend a huge amount of time discussing that, but there were some key points that came across. Remember, this is a discussion between environmental researchers on one side and those working in industry, the professionals. And they actually had a consensus in that they thought that there's obviously a huge amount of work goes into these reports, but if they seem to be focused around COPs, and that we might want to think about how we reformat the messaging of that science. Could they actually be fired at particular global leader meetings like G7 or other, think of it in a sort of public relations sense. Additionally, these are appointed scientists. Could we actually validate and improve the messaging that's coming out from their work more effectively, perhaps by involving wider scientific communities? I think that's perhaps a cry from the professionals who may be able to add some extra data perspective into that, and encourage its perhaps the credibility within industry geoscience. Practically, what may industry be able to help with in terms of refining the actual conclusions from IPCC science? Can we persuade industry to release more data and knowledge and expertise? But on top of that, there are some specific requests from the environmental researchers, which is to delve into past extreme events. And the Earth has produced some truly astonishing things in its past. They tend to be lower occurrence, but very high impact. And it's very challenging to get the granularity of those events in the geological record, but it's sometimes possible. And the data may be there, and it just needs to be made accessible. And for this to become part of this global venture that we're on. We can return to that maybe in a minute in terms of releasing data and for industry, big industry to move. So that's working group one, the actual present state, if you like, of the climate. Working group two, which is all about adaptation, really to pick up on the fact that Earth scientists is nothing new. We don't really need selling on the messages that are being made. The big message from us is we need to get on with it. We need to start building. We need to become more resilient, and ultimately to create new solutions, of which we have many. The red flag has been up for ages. How do we do this? As we move into this adaptive phase, it's all about us actually perhaps forgetting our traditional, almost 19th century labels, and to work together, work around this problem, to shape our work around the problem itself. Interesting point that perhaps the climatologists, it's their point now to hand over the baton, to continue their work, but really the activity now and the attention needs to be on adapting ultimately these solutions. Where the climate scientists can help is in specific areas. And what was very interesting was to see that one area that everyone gravitated around was carbon sequestration. This is something which was a niche area. Certainly when I was at university, we knew we could do it. It's something which is something for big industry to do, but we know how to do it. It's never really been scaled. The messages coming from IPCC and also from IEA are, we now need this. And very intriguing to hear from our atmospheric physicist on the panel that climatologists much prefer putting greenhouse gases into the ground rather than these quite experimental and potentially risky geoengineering solutions. I think that's a really important message to get across. In terms of the solutions, if you like, working group 3, what does this look like? It's what the industry people are most interested in, because this is going to shape how we work as earth scientists, as professionals for decades to come. There's less and less argument about the situation in terms of the state of the climate. It's now, what do we build? And how do we resource ourselves energetically and in terms of the minerals and metals that we need? We should also bear in mind that there's a double crisis going on. It's not just the climate, it's the biosphere. And planning, really holistic planning, is going to be extremely important here. Nothing is going to happen unless there is a both tactical and strategic approach to the way our environment looks, whether that be rewilding right through to how buildings are constructed. Without getting into politics too much, we obviously have some large political entities in the world that can influence things. And certainly those of us who work at the European level believe that the EU has a fantastic role to play there. We have the Brussels effect. What the EU decides to do often has a positive race to the top effect that percolates more broadly. Practically, how do we get these solutions in place? There's policy, yes. Then there's the finance. We now need to mobilize finance. So who do we need to speak to? We need to speak to policymakers, yes. We need to speak to financiers now. And some of these things, and it's not necessarily a thing which for earth sciences is natural, is to figure out how we sequestrate carbon dioxide into the subsurface and do it in an economic way. There must be a motivation for doing that. There must be a price for not doing it. And for other solutions, take geothermal. There are innovative activities going on in terms of finding alternative finance. It isn't necessarily going out to the capital markets. It's actually communities can do things themselves. So we need to be creative. We need to have dialogue with those who are interested in sustainable finance. That wave is coming. You can see that in London in particular. Recommendations beyond that for ourselves are, perhaps we need to think about the fora that we operate and communicate with the world on. How do we create impact? We can have this conversation today and we have a lot of consensus. There's a lot of energy. We're not arguing dramatically among ourselves as earth scientists. We are the custodians of this science, and we are going to provide, with engineers in particular, the actual practical solutions. So we need to have a hard think about our ambassadors, if you like, for that message. So that's something I really like to convey to everyone who's not an earth scientist here. And let's get on with it.
Great, thank you. Lots of good challenges there, Glenn. So I think really interesting to hear some members of the climate science community say, well, is it time for us to step back is our work here done? But also I think some clear recognition that the data sets that you have and the information is still vitally important. So an interesting challenge to that community about how to share that and how to share that well and work with others on using those bits of information. Really good solutions focused ideas there too, because of course the geological and earth science community is really important to solutions. You gave the example of storage, but plenty other places where that information needs to be shared to make solutions happen, and at a kind of local level than we see in the IPCC report. I think that's really interesting. And then some really practical examples there, talking about the finance community, for example, and that's maybe a bit similar to the risk community discussion that I think happened in Anita's group. There are lots of people out there now moving finance capital or trying to protect assets that actually need some of the information that the earth science community have. And, you know, there may be space there for more research, but also space for working together in ways that hasn't happened before. And of course, plenty of other great suggestions there too from Glenn and his group. So a really rich set of things there. I think that final challenge that Glenn gave us, which is we might all agree on this call, lots of things to do. Where do we start, and how do we make sure that these things are happening? And who do we need to work with? And who, you know, how can we enhance? You know, some good examples there also in the chat of programs that many of you are already involved in. So some of these things are happening. How can we make that happen better, or help scale that up, or be as effective as possible? So I am just going to open the floor for people to actually put up their hands, so that, first of all, rather than I decide which bit of this we're going to explore, see who's the most eager to jump in. So if you can use your electronic hand, please, to jump in if someone wants to comment on any of the discussions in the groups you were either in or not in. Great, Nuha, please go ahead.
So thank you, Alisa, for bringing up these key recommendations from the 3 different groups. And I just want to follow up on one of the key points that we ended up with, third group, which is being innovative when it comes into communication. And I'm just thinking beyond our workshop today, that going back to reality, and now we're heading up to the core very soon, which is the fact that all of these fantastic recommendations that we came up with will end up in the hands of the politicians and the decision makers to be really eager to take action on. So I think it's our role now as scientists to be able to translate things that we spoke about earlier, for example, in the group, the business group with Anita, which is moving from risk modeling into risk communication. So not only for the communities, but also for the decision makers, for them to understand what do we mean actually by compound impacts of events. How are we going to break this data on risk financing, risk modeling into very clear language for them to understand it's a priority for taking action on, it's a priority for financing, and it's a priority for understanding what is a tolerable risk, a risk that can be tolerated at the community level in order to invest in building resilience. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Nuha. And that's interesting because I think you bring together there the translation of the risk itself for decision makers, but in fact also an indication that you'd like to have some influence on risk tolerance and decision making actually in communities. And I think we should remember that some of the academic research that we have isn't just on the natural science side for that. Some of that probably is on the social science side too, demonstrating how communities respond and what is the level of acceptability to that for that. So we need to find better routes into those conversations perhaps. So really interesting point there. Another hand up, go ahead.
Yeah, hi to all, and I'm one of those social scientists, by the way.
Great.
My point is just follows up on this and takes on a conversation I was having via email with a stakeholder in Italy this morning. We are assuming that there is awareness of some of the dynamic of complex risk because right now the discourse is mainstream. When I hear Biden speaking in his inaugural lecture about cascading risk, I wanted to cry of happiness. But the reality is we need also to have a clear roadmap of which are the practical steps for implementation from local authority to international organization in order to have a checklist and progress. Otherwise, we risk to get them lost in the conversation. When I talk with my colleagues in the boroughs, the administrative unity of London, they want to do everything. They're great, but they're maybe 1/3 of the people they should be because of resource cuts, because of right now they are in first line since like 1.5 years. I barely know how they can standing. So the awareness that they have limited resources. We cannot go having communication about big system analysis with somebody that doesn't even have the time, but what they are very responsive is whatever is practically helping them doing day-to-day business and introduce something new to keep it operational. So having different level of maturity in all this, stepping from the basics that can be applicable in my small village in Italy, where they maybe they have risk map now. And similarly, in other parts of Latin America more than the global south, and making it replicable and scalable. This is passing through all the communication, and I think this is something vital that we should all understand. People have limited resources. They need to answer to the leadership and CEO that maybe have the problem got to be re-elected in 1 year and need to show results. So practicality and starting from the basics.
Yeah, that's great. Some really good contributions there. I think it's true, you were mentioning particularly local government, but that's also very true, for example, in schools. And I saw that someone posted in the chat, all of the different kinds of people you need to connect with in schools, governors, parents, and so on. And all of those people in all of those roles have actually a set of key performance indicators, for lack of a better, less jargony word, that they have to meet, and they've got limited resources, and they will focus on those. That's, I think, on the schools front, I like that suggestion of exam boards and so on, working with those people who are powerful in those already in those structures and ecosystems, and will probably take us a lot further than trying to add on something new. But also recognizing timeframes, as you said, and trying to provide something that people can really use and can be scaled up. So some really good recommendations there. Katrina.
Thank you. It's actually following on from exactly the same point, whether it's a school or whether it's a government minister or an international person. I think we need to be really specific about the call to action. I think that we do need to break it down. I don't think we need to be scared of complex communications. It's a complex issue at the end of the day. And I don't think that one message is going to fit all. We have to say, this is the message that we've got for an 11-year-old. This is the message that we've got for a government minister. But more so than just sharing the problem and saying, hey, this is the problem that we've got and this is what we're doing and we'd like to educate you on it. We need to say, and this is what you can do. These are the 3 things that you can do next that can happen, that can make this work. As a former, I've worked in the Cabinet Office in a variety of different places in the UK before I've done the work that I've done. And the biggest question that I always ask for myself is, what are you asking me to do? If I was going to pick up the phone and phone someone and ask them to do something, who would I phone and what would it be that I'm asking them to do, and how would I measure success? And I think that when we, as communicators, ask people to listen to us, often we're speaking to ourselves. And what we need to be doing is speaking to them and being very specific about how little amount of time we need them to take to help us achieve our goal. And we need to be more respectful in that regard. So that's my thought. I don't know if it's a little bit belligerent, but I do think that succinct nature of communications is really required.
Right. Yeah. Thanks, Katrina. Yeah. Be succinct and clear, and know what you're really asking someone to deliver. Absolutely. All right. Anyone else want to jump in then on some of the other discussion points that were raised earlier, or elaborate on some of the recommendations that people were making? Okay, well, maybe let's just pick up then on Anita, in your group, there were some actions that seem to be heading our way at the Grantham Institute, so make sure that I understand those properly before we finish this discussion. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about, and maybe in light of now what Glenn said about what the earth science community were interested in doing in terms of data, a little bit about what you think that collaboration between businesses and scientists could look a little bit more like.
Absolutely. I mean, the words that I've scribbled down are risk communication. In a sense, it's what Katrina's just referenced and others have referenced. It's the communication. I mean, I remember going to a talk before my global governance MSc at UCL, and there was a whole session around communication. So the scientists were frustrated that they needed to be able to communicate this more widely. And it's only now, as human beings, we react to what we see in the media. Climate change is now headline news, but actually, as we've discussed, there's so many different risks emanating from this and the complexity around it. So absolutely, I mean, if the Grantham Institute is willing to further discussions around this, we can have a risk communication working group and bring in all the different groups to think about communication specifically, what information we're trying to communicate. And to Nula's point about, I think societal tolerance of this has reduced. So we can work with that to be able to understand how society is perceiving this and be able to talk to them in everyday language. As I say, we have all the toolkits, we have the scientific evidence. It's how we communicate what is a complex issue. So we're willing to do that. I'm sure a number of my panel members and people from the audience would be willing to join that group.
Okay, great. Thanks. So a bit climate risk communication there. Anyone want to jump in either from that group or from the group of Earth scientists a little bit about that topic or any of the other things that Glenn recommended? Everyone had such faith in the chair. Okay, Malini first and then Glenn.
Yeah, thank you, Alyssa. I want to pick up on this issue of risk and risk communication. So if we're talking about climate risk, we have to also set systemic risk. Otherwise, we will make the mistake that we address one set of risks, excluding other sets of risks. And COVID has been an absolute, a really shining example of poor practice here, because we've known and governments have known for donkey's years about the risk of zoonotic pandemics. One of the hats that I wear is as an advisor to the head of the United Nations Disaster Risk Agency. And for the last several years, we've been producing biannual global risk assessment reports. So this is the bread and butter of what we do at UNDRR. And what we are moving towards in a post-Sendai context. So you'll all be familiar that for 10 years, we had the Hyogo disaster risk framework. And in 2015, along with the Paris Agreement, we adopted the Sendai framework on disaster risk management. Now, most policymakers have never heard of Sendai, but they have heard of Paris. And we need to bridge that gap, because Sendai calls for a systematic approach to risk management, to recognizing multiple hazards that have to be addressed. Otherwise, we will continue to have this absurd situation where people only talk about climate mitigation, i.e. decarbonization, and completely miss the bleeding obvious, which is that climate change is occurring as we speak. And schools and homes and offices are at risk of flooding in this country, and that we are increasing our heat risk in every indoor environment and outdoor environment. So one has to think in a complex manner. And Katrina, you're absolutely right. It is entirely possible to communicate simply and elegantly highly complex issues. It's something that we do at UNDRR every day of the week. So whichever grouping comes out of this, I would love to connect you to the broader piece of work that we're doing within the UN system, because we work very closely with business and professional communicators to get the word out. So that's
okay.
My stand.
Great, Malini. But I think it's not necessarily a guarantee that we're going to take on an enormous work program for this discussion on that topic. But if we do, then great to connect. And as I said, there are lots of initiatives we're all involved in already in these spaces. So it's just how we can do it better or scale it up, etc. So thanks very much, Malini, for that, Malini. I think I have Glenn next and then Katrina.
A couple of quick points. I hope I'm not too provocative about this. I think our language is important if we're talking about communication here, right? And there is some trouble with the word risk. It sounds kind of soft and it might not happen. And we also have confusion about whether it's positive or negative. Essentially what we're dealing with here, and it is fundamentally human psychology, particularly social psychology. And we've seen this with all these crises, and the fact that even when we know that the primary item on the UK's risk register is a pandemic, we don't do anything about it sufficiently. Perhaps we could reframe this as a number of decisions that are going to have to be made under uncertainty. I mean, that's how, as a scientist, we think of this. And if we make quality decisions, and there's going to be a number of them, and we debias, and we have options, practical options, and we then analyze them, and then we give decision makers usually 3 or 4 options. That's how we get things done, I think. But to do that, we almost need to take a kind of marketing approach to this. And part of that, I think, the other second aspect of this is to be positivist. I've heard a lot of people saying it's time to stop with the doom and gloom. Even if we know that there are threats coming our way, we have to turn these into opportunities, because that's how, again, human beings, our brains are still back in the savannah in many ways. You know, we're quite simple creatures living in a very complex world that we've created for ourselves. And we've got to work with that psychology. And there's got to be these motivational contracts, you know, whether it comes to pumping CO2 back into the ground, whether it's persuading oil and gas companies to repivot, and the public at large. Maybe in what COP26 could do, you know, really successfully, a big success to me would be if it mobilizes finance and convinces the world, particularly the private sector, there's a massive opportunity here. People are going to act on this if they feel happy about doing it. And that's something we've got to learn as we move. I think this is a crucial point. Scaring and, you know, making people afraid goes so far, but actually now let's use some human psychology here and motivate people.
Okay, great. Thanks, Glenn. So a good day for the social scientists on these conversations. I can see your hand as well, Anita, but I'm afraid we're going to have to be drawing it to a close in a moment. So I'm going to take a quick comment from Katrina and then going to invite Liz Bentley to close off the session for today. You mentioned marketing there, Glenn, and I think that's completely valid. You'll see a nice comment here from Becky Venton in the chat here about recognize, you know, that communication has lots of different aspects, and I think we should absolutely embrace skills like marketing and so on to think about how we're sharing these things at different levels and different kinds of messaging. Katrina.
Well, in the danger of sounding like an Instagram meme, if it wasn't complex, we would have fixed it by now. And the point is that it is complex and we shouldn't be scared about that. But the wonderful thing is, and just consider the number of brains in the room at the moment. If we all stick to our own knitting and do the things that we do best, then we'll be able to get it done. And for me, I'm sitting here in New Zealand, and actually CO2 is not the major issue for us here, methane is. And we've got too many cows and too many sheep, and their farming community are the things that can actually make a difference. We could actually make a difference by making that our priority so that the rest of the world can learn from us. If we're all trying to solve the same problem at the same time, then how are we going to solve all of the problems? Because all we're going to do is compete for solutions. And just, I feel as if I keep speaking for Kit, but Kit mentioned in our session, you know, if we can put our hands in our pocket and find money to help with COVID, then and take that on as a world issue, then why can't we do it for this, especially when it's shining light on us at the moment? And I think that that's probably the burning platform that we need to put under the decision makers for COP or for whatever. But I really do think, you know, we've shown that that as a globe, humanity can take on a problem and say, okay, we all need to have a similar approach and do it in a different way. But I do think we should all stick to our own knitting as well and do the things that we do best.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Katrina.
As we done.
Great. So thank you everyone for your contributions. Some really great ideas there about how we can share the load, but also achieve more together. You know, focus on our strengths, but also do some of that more together. So I think we'll be gathering together the umpteen notes and comments that we've taken from the main session now, as well as all of the smaller sessions. I'm going to do a little bit of a plug very briefly with another hat on. I chair the COP26 Universities Network, which is the UK network that was formed in advance of COP, trying to bring evidence to a range of people. And we are doing a little mini event on climate risk, 3 afternoons from the 29th to the 1st of October inclusive. The last one might be closed, I can't remember, but it's on climate risk communication. So I'll be taking some of these into those groups, but the other sessions on the 29th and 30th will be open. I am going to hand over to Liz now to close off this second day of our 2 kind of co-events that we ran together with the Royal Meteorological Society. But thank you all for helping us take the IPCC report and make it really a little bit more practical, which I think is really, of course, vitally important. Over to you, Liz.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lisa. Yeah, so a really big thank you for me, really, to Grantham for pulling this session together. It's been a really interesting and stimulating discussion. I've really enjoyed dipping into one of the sectors, but also hearing the summing up. And I'll draw out some key points in a minute. But yes, big thank you to Grantham, to those who were leading in the different groups and those contributing to each group. So big thank you. I think there were a few points that I really drew from the conversation, and I'm hoping this closes this off nicely. But there's a definite need to kind of have an impact focus and, you know, an adaptation focus as well. And that was coming out from all three of the groups. Communication is key. Communication at different levels with different communities, facilitating information sharing between sectors, between organisations, the kind of thing we're doing here today is also key. And being innovative in our communication as well. So again, that's something that came out very clearly. Building resilience. So, you know, that needs to be scalable as well, big and small, thinking about operational continuity. So again, that came out certainly from some of the groups that I was listening to. And collaboration is key. That was definitely a message, a headline message that came out from the group that I was sat in, collaboration, but I'm sure that cuts across everybody as well. And then finally, really just not to underestimate our own influence and the importance that each of us can make. And I think just to leave a final message as we kind of move away from this, that, you know, actions by us as individuals, every little action helps, and action is needed now. And it's clear. You know, the evidence is clear from the report, from the IPCC report, but the solutions are there, and, you know, there's an opportunity for us all now to go and make a difference. So I think I'll just leave it on that kind of note, that we can all go away and start now to make a difference individually, but also as a group, and coming back together to collaborate on these things. So thank you very much.